I was just giving him praise and honor and saying, hey, every time I see him on a YouTube video because he's speaking at a lodge or he's on another Masonic podcast or just another podcast, I'm like, I know that guy. That's my guy. That's my favorite historian, Brother Chris
Wow.
Ruli, back on the Craftsman Online podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. But do we really know who we are in truth, or is this a philosophical podcast, or is this a history podcast? Who knows?
Well, when you're here, we do a little bit of both.
Okay.
And I'm lucky to be able to say, not only a friend to the show, but a friend to me personally, somebody who I look out for. And, like I said, when I see on social media, Brother Chris Ruli speaking at this lodge, I'm like, it's like the George Washington once stayed here signs
Wow.
to me. I'm like, I know that guy. So
Oh
very
boy,
happy for
checks in the
this.
mail. Checks in the mail. So
Well, we're talking about his new book, which will be coming out just in time for the hype that is America 250. If you loved the White House and the Freemasons, you're going to love Congress and the Freemasons. As you described it, it's kind of a sequel, but is it? I'm wondering the I guess the process for researching is somewhat similar, but I'm going to guess the stories are going to be vastly different.
yeah, I mean, I guess you're right. It's not necessarily a sequel, but perhaps you can call it a companion piece to White House and the Freemasons. And really, it's a holistic, comprehensive, whatever you want to call it, look at the fraternity's engagement with public servants that worked in Congress. So we're
Hmm.
talking congressmen, we're talking folks that physically worked in other Library of Congress. I mean, I even looked at the U.S. Botanical Garden. I looked at a lot of different things that are organized, managed, owned by the United States Congress because I wanted to answer these fundamental questions about Freemasonry and public service. And so I did White House. Now we're looking at Congress.
It's interesting because you're going from the man, kind of from the White House, right,
Yeah,
to the institution. And when
yeah,
I say the institution, it's like historically, nobody has worse performance ratings or approval ratings than the US Congress. That's usually their favored least than the president of the United States, no matter how hard they try historically to dive bomb their own popularity. Congress is always there to be like, hey, I got you, bro, hold my beer. However, though, I was thinking of you. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was my introduction to Congress back when we had this thing called civics in 8th grade that we all went and sat in that class. I was like, oh, cool. The idea that an everyday man could go serve Congress someday.
yeah.
What happened? Where did that disconnect, do you think, kind of began? And did you see a line somewhere where there were Freemasons who were congressmen before Congress became what we know it is today?
Right, right. Well, to answer the latter part of your question, yes, because what I did was I went through every single iteration of Congress, right? So not just the Congress that is formed in 1789 or during or after the Revolution, but I also took a look at what Masonic research do we have on those, the Albany Congress, right? The Stamp Act Congress, the first Continental Congress, the second Continental. So I really went through all these instances where even before the American Revolution, where delegates from these different colonies, or prior to the United States, these colonies came together and said, we want to form some type of collective organization. We don't really know what that is yet. And it so happens that certain members who were elected to go to those delegates or delegations or conventions and congresses turned out to be Masons. And so I was curious, like, okay, well, how many of them went? What did they do? What was their interaction? What was their legacy? Do we have any documentation on the things that, and if anything, do we have anything on how Masonry helped contribute to those discussions, those debates? The types of things that Masonic historians have been trying to work out for 2 centuries, at least within the Masonic American context.
My brain is starting to overheat from the amount of maths that's required here, because we joked like, hey, this book, a timely release, it's coming out in July, just as we get hyped up for America 250. We'll be right into our sweet spot with the July 4th holiday.
Right.
And I'm thinking here going, I couldn't even put a ballpark number on how many members of Congress we have had. When you think of all the Congresses, there's like, I'm
Right.
thinking of when you're telling the story, I'm like, oh, the Continental Congress. Well, sure, there was probably brother so and so and so and so and so. We know the Declaration of Independence signers. We know but all the way up till today and everybody in between, like if you had to put a rough number around it, how many men was on this list of possible Masons?
Well, we know. Well, I mean, I think I'm going to argue. I'm going to put a little of my. I'm going to pat myself on the back here and say that through the work that I've been doing the last couple of years, we've got about 2,450, so 2,450 known Masons who served in Congress.
Okay.
That's the first time anyone's really done a thorough review since, up to now, in terms of, and how do you do that? Well, there's a couple different resources that are available, but I just started with the congressional directories, because a lot of congressional directories will tell you he's an elk, he's a Shriner, he's a
Okay.
whatever. And so I started that compilation. There's a lot of other research that's been done by my predecessors, but they never got to 100%. And it's really difficult because a lot of the earlier Congresses, we don't really have declarative information about where this person was a Mason, when he was initiated. So a lot of that, George Washington's lucky, right? Because George Washington is a member of the Continental Congress. We know where he was initiated. We know a lot about his history, but there's a lot of Masons that we just don't really know a lot about. But I've calculated that it's over 2,400 Masons that have served in Congress.
George Washington was lucky, but also brother Chris Ruli was lucky to know that George Washington, you could connect all those dots.
Well, because that was a lot easier to get that than some of these really difficult problem child.
I can imagine. And I definitely want to get into the stories, because that was one of the things that fascinated me with the first book. And I'm sure your fans of the first book will be like, oh man, the White House and the Freemasons. I learned so much, not just about the occupants of the White House, the men who sat in the Oval Office, the key decision makers, the executives of our country, but also other people that were part of the history of the White House. And I'm sure you're going to have some of those kind of highlights that we can get to for this episode. Yeah. But I did kind of want to get to just some level setting here, because I'm sure as you were going through the research and digging through some of the stuff that was digitized and some of the stuff that maybe you could actually put hands and fingers on, did you see a certain point in the history of the United States where we had less members of Congress who were Masons, or it was harder to find out if they were a Mason or not?
Well, one of the things that I'm doing, and what we will have in the book, is I put every single Mason on in an Excel sheet, and I calculated when their terms of service was. So for each year, I said, okay, well, how many Masons served in the Senate? How many Masons served in the House of Representatives? What political party were they? Which state were they coming from? And so you have this really big data set, and I think it's the only data set that's available in the world right now, based on all that data that I'm working on. And so what I can tell you is you sort of get 20 to 30% of Congress at one point are involved somehow with the fraternity. There's a really great story in, I want to say 1926 or 1927, and it comes out of the Supreme Council of the Southern Jurisdiction, when the Grand Commander of the Supreme Council mentions in his allocution, biennial session, he mentions in his report that he attended a dinner for one of the lodges here in DC, that they had 500 Masons that served in Congress attend this dinner. Now, if you do the math, it's almost physically impossible to have that many Masons in Congress at the time. So I think what he meant was, of those individuals who were congressmen, and then all those individuals who worked as staffers, as clerks, as secretaries, as all those sort of things. And so you get to the 1920s and you see 200, maybe 200, 300, and 200 probably is on the median end. I would probably say it's like 250 congressmen served at one time total percentage that were Masons. And so unfortunately, I don't have the full numbers right now because we're still verifying data. One of the things that I'm doing is, as part of my project, was, okay, I can find this online, but I wanted all the Grand Lodges to be responsible for their data set. So I compiled the 2,450 names, and I sent it out to all the Grand Lodges. So all the Grand Lodges have their state's representatives. And so they're looking for it, and they're reviewing it and telling me, okay, this is right, this is wrong. You got, hey, Chris, you got the wrong lodge number for this guy. This guy was, John Smith the second. You want John Smith the first. Here's his date. And so they're doing a lot of that data validation work right now. So once that validation work comes through, then we can really say, here's the number, here's as best as we can do to get it, and here's the stories that come from that.
You kind of touched on one of the sources, and I was curious for research where you were going. I mean, the internet is one thing.
Yeah.
I know you have a lot of access at the Scottish Rite, Southern Masonic jurisdiction, with the House of the Temple and some of the great archives they have there. Where were some of the other places you were going to get this information?
Yeah, so there's a really good book called 10,000 Famous Masons by Denslow. And Denslow, well, what I realized is I had a copy at the House of the Temple. I knew it's a really great resource. Masonic researchers who are listening to this podcast certainly know about it. And one of the things that I did was I pulled a lot of information from Denslow. In the introduction of Denslow's book, he tells me, well, I actually got all this data because there was, for many years, a membership card catalog that the librarian of the Supreme Council maintained. And so every 2 years, the librarians at the Supreme Council will reach out to new members of Congress and say, hey, are you a Mason? Or did you ever join the fraternity? Even if you demitted, what years were you? And so they compiled this really complicated card catalog. And unfortunately, around the 1950s and 60s, they just stopped doing that. I'm not really sure why. I'm not sure. Maybe the librarians just didn't really care about collecting that information. But what I realized, it overlaps nicely with the fact that starting in the 1950s, the Masonic Service Association starts to track how many Masons there are in public service. And so they're the ones collecting, which secretary of whatever was a Mason and which congressman. And so they picked up that sort of, they picked up the proverbial whatever, and the baton, let's say, and then they did that for the, up until the 1990s, I'd say. So from 1789 all the way to about 1990s, we have those records. And unfortunately, not unfortunately, but fortunately, we have Masons that are in Congress right now. They're staffers, they're a couple Masons who actually are congressmen who have been helping us with the current list. Who's active, who do we know, which Prince Hall Masons are there. And so it's really been a team effort to compiling this list.
So I'm trying to put together the makeup here because you live in the DC area.
Sure.
You're a Freemason. You're also a historian, which I like to call an accountant of history, because I love historians how they're wired to say, ooh, this belongs here. We need to organize this for future generations to find. There's that researcher gene that's in you. There's also a little bit of a nerd gene that's with, that comes with being a historian, which we know and love. All of us have it that are Masons. But the other part I'm hoping is that so desperately as a Freemason, kind of what happened with the White House and the Freemasons, you want to hear, your fingers are crossed, that the most important men to the history of our country, in that fabric is weaved the thread of Freemasonry, and that Freemasonry helped them be better or help serve the people better. What was part of the goal or part of the desire that you had to also take on this passion project for Congress and the Freemasons?
Yeah. It comes from 2 points. One, I think from a practical perspective, because I'm pretty sure you and everyone who's ever listened to this podcast, if you're a Mason and you've been in some meeting where the topic has come up and we say, Masons helped, build the United States. They're foundational to the origin of the United States. And I was very curious about that question because whenever I asked, they said, well, we don't really have any information on that. Or you should check out this book. Well, that book, whatever, was printed in the 1920s. And so you have 100 years plus of data that we just didn't have. And so from a practical perspective, I was very just like, how can I get this data? How can I make it available for others? How can we actually quantify and figure out who was who? And how do we have one resource that can answer this question? From a non-practical, maybe you can call it symbolic perspective, I think I was just curious to understand if that's true. Is it really true that Masons did the things that we claim that we did? And I was really curious also, did that change over time? Did we always think this way? Did we always say back in, the early 1800s, oh, Masons helped build, the United States, or, they were foundational in terms of how they engaged with the formation of the United States. And so I wanted to understand, where did that come from? Where did that idea come from? The way that we talk about the fraternity came from. And so I think that those were the two main reasons why. And if you want to add a third, because we're Masons, I'm one of these neurotic completists. We've got a catalog. We've got to include it. I've got to include on this list. One of the great things is, as I was going through the record of all millions, and I mean millions, and I mean millions of records, of publicly available records of Congress, I found other stuff to complete things I completely missed from the White House and the Freemasons. So now I'm going, oh crap, I've got letters from, Gerald Ford and Lyndon B. Johnson and all these things that I've got to now create a second edition of my first book, because they were just hidden in public records for Congress.
Love that you're finding more work for yourself.
It's a never-ending cycle, an Ouroboros.
I also feel that, knowing and being involved with politics is that most Americans, and we should have would be a closer relationship with our member of Congress, because in most instances, these are our neighbors or people who are in our community that we can point to, that we went to school with them, or we know somebody who knows them. Whereas the president is a little bit more of a distant memory.
Yes.
I want to kind of get to some of these stories, because I'm sure the listener is just jumping up and down and say, get to the stories. Who are some of the people that we're going to highlight? And was there a particular story where you're like, oh man, this is the one. This is the one example of Congress and the Freemasons.
Yeah. Well, you can sort of bucket or group fraternal interaction into sort of these 4 periods, I like to say. And I noticed that within those 4 periods, the way that the fraternity engaged with Congress and vice versa is sort of unique. It's yes, there's a little bit of, overflow or and sort of connections, but mostly these are these 4 separate periods of how they engage with each other. The earliest period, I would say, it's very practical, right? We are forming these institutions, and with that, Congress charters organizations and institutions, and Masonic groups receive a charter to organize themselves. And we know there's a little bit of record of evidence that Masons visited Congress, visited Masons. There was a procession. John Quincy Adams, in his diary, mentions that when he was in Congress, around St. John's Day, he met a a procession of Masons that visited the Capitol, along with a delegation of American Indians who wanted to, meet Congress. We then, so that's the early period. We then sort of see in the, I don't know what to call it, but sort of late turn after the Civil War and into the turn of the 20th century, the fraternity becomes a little bit more political. I'm going to put those quotes in political. And what that means is the fraternity realizes that it's got a lot of members. It's got a lot of interest. It's got a lot of enthusiasm, and these members are starting to mobilize. They're starting to say, hey, wait a minute, this fraternity is making money. It's giving money to charities. It's engaging with members. And so we can act as a sort of pseudo PAC, right? You know what a PAC is, or at least
Political Action Committee. Yeah.
Yes. I don't want to say the word PAC, because that means that it's like a structured organization. It's not. But what I'm trying to say is Freemasons start to lobby.
Right. Well, they recognize they had influence on a social and moral perspective. Correct. Yeah.
And now we'll talk a little bit about why. Well, we say no politics in religion, but let me explain to you how politics is involved. Right. So in the 1920s, for example, the Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction, John Henry Coles, is testifying before Congress, saying that the fraternity, or at least the Spring Council of the Southern Jurisdiction, supports the creation of a Department of Education. This is the 1920s. When is the actual Department of Education formed? In the 80s, I believe, or 80s or 90s. So this is 50 or 60 years before they actually create a Department of Education. The head of the Scottish Rite Spring Council is in Congress testifying that we should do this. Around the same time, I see in congressional reports the head of the grotto, right? The MOVPER, that's the acronym, writes a letter to the President of the United States saying that his organization, the grotto, the fraternal organization, supports tightening and restricting laws against the traffic of narcotics, the production and the distribution of narcotics. He's saying it's really important as a fraternal organization. This impacts our members. And you need to do something about it, Mr. President and members of Congress. These are letters from our organization to Congress and the fraternity. In addition to that, I'm going to keep moving forward. John Henry Coles, the same guy that comes to Congress and talks about how it's important that we should have a Department of Education, is also sending to congressional members materials, documents, newspaper articles, things that he's written in his own publication, warning the United States and its people about the atrocities that are going on in Italy, in fascist Italy under Mussolini. These people are attacking Masons. It's really important that we step up and do something. In the 1960s or 70s, actually it was in the 70s, a national organization, the National Sojourners, pass in their annual their meeting, their annual meeting, the national organization comes together. They pass a series of resolutions supporting the war in Vietnam and the President of the United States. One Grand Lodge, again, these are all in the congressional records. One Grand Lodge in the 1950s passes a resolution during their Grand Lodge session to send to Congress about creating a stricter nationalization and immigration policy in the government, saying that if you are a foreign national, you can come to the United States and live here for 1 year, but after that 1 year, you have to register to become an American citizen. Now, I thought we're not supposed to talk about politics and religion in American Freemasonry. And then we say, well, Chris, this is being done outside of the tiled lodge. But we're talking about resolutions that are submitted on behalf of organizations about politics and political action and political change. Right. Now, the third bucket, right? So that was the first bucket, institutional. We're creating charters, we're getting people involved, we're laying cornerstones, we're doing all this stuff. Second phase, around political action, we've got this big group of Masons, we really should do something about it. The second starts to focus on Americanism, right? So this is after the Cold War, or excuse me, this is during the Cold War, right? After the Second World War. You start to see in congressional records, Masons talking about how important it is to become a Freemason because you're helping your country. The fraternity was always a patriotic organization. Look at the things that we've done, God bless George Washington, etc. So that's really what you start to see in this period. A lot of materials are coming out talking about how it's important to be a good citizen. Being a good citizen means being a good Freemason, stuff like that. And then the last phase, and by the way, in addition to that, there's some great, for example, an example of this instance where we violate the no politics and Freemasonry rule is the Conference of Prince Hall Grand Masters puts out a resolution in support of the United States government against communism. Because what you start to see is a lot of the FBI, or at least there is a perception that Prince Hall lodges are places where communism is spreading. And so to counteract this idea during the Cold War, the Conference of Grand Masters of Prince Hall said, wait a minute, we support the United States government, we denounce communism, stuff like that. And so that's a very clear indication to me of how much that, how important that decision needed to be made. And then that was given to the United States Congress. The last phase, right? So we got 4 phases. The last phase is perhaps the one that certainly it's the one that we're in now, which is more retrospective in nature. We're asking our congressmen, our local congressmen, to create a little note commemorating the 100th anniversary of our lodge, the 100th anniversary or the 200th anniversary of our Grand Lodge. We are recognizing an important Mason. And so it's sort of devolved, I don't know if devolved is the right term, but we sort of prioritized, let's recognize what we've done in the past. Let's have commemorations, anniversaries. And so that's the sort of fourth bucket that we go into in terms of our, relationship with the fraternity.
Do you feel it's interesting that Freemasonry was kind of a symbol, for lack of a better term, of Americana or the spirit of
Yeah.
America or what America represents through these phases? That was kind of the thread that I kind of
Yeah.
pulled from that. Do you feel that retrospectively looking back on it, like Freemasonry had a better relationship with the White House, or do you feel like Freemasonry had a better relationship with the US Congress based on your research?
That's a very good question. I I would say that there was a lot more engagement with Congress than there was with the White House by virtue of the fact that there were a lot more congressmen, there were a lot more
Mm,
opportunities, and quite frankly, congressmen. I mean, I hate to say it, but some congressmen are bored. They're not doing all the work that's happening, and so
right.
they're more interested in staying in office and doing the sort of types of things that they'll be doing now. And so I think they want to be invited to attend
Right.
the cornerstone laying ceremonies. They want to speak. They'll go to the Grand Lodge sessions. Some will be appointed grand orators or these titles. They may attend, they may speak, and then may head out. I mean, so I think we certainly have more. Well, I think because the nature, the virtue, the fact that there were so many Mason congressmen compared to 15 or 14, depending on what your number is of Mason presidents, I think you start to see that uh, Congress is more. It engages a bit more. That
Yeah.
said, oh, sorry, just to tack on to the last piece. That said, we obviously see when a president of the United States is doing some public Masonic event, obviously members of Congress participate in that as well. So there's a clear recognition that both houses are being recognized. It's important to have both chambers of both branches, both branches of the American government participate. And of course, the third branch, judicial, of course, there were plenty of Mason, justices, and they participate in events too.
Yeah, well, to that point, because the White House is the people's house, right?
Mhm.
And the Congress is the people's body. It's the
Right,
legislative body.
right.
As we touched, there's like more connections, there's more accessibility as
Yeah,
well, and there's more use for it. So, yeah, I think maybe to the way that you put it, it could have been considered an unfair question on my end. Not to say that
no,
the
no, no.
president didn't want to be involved, but it's just fascinating to hear when you take a step back and you think about the many elected leaders that we have sent to the Congress over the course of history, how many of them walked in with a Masonic ring on and were living
Yeah,
our values and thinking of us or carrying the things that we believed in our hearts to be true to go forward. And where were they going as members of the fraternity that would have been visiting brothers? Were they attending lodges here? You had a lot of information on the White House and the presidents who had to kind of seek affiliation with some of the lodges here in the DC area. What did you
right.
learn about our members of Congress?
Well, unfortunately, if I sort of had to trim down the book because if you had every single interaction with every
Right.
single member of Congress in D.C., the book that field of thought would have just been 600 pages. But Masons invited members of Congress. Members of Congress were more than happy to participate in events and dinners and activities and balls and all the different social aspects of being in DC and the fraternity. And in some cases, right, like James Garfield, right, there was a great Netflix documentary, not, well, it was a Netflix movie about Garfield and his death and his sort of like only term in office in the White House. His example is a very unique example because he comes from Congress, he comes to the District of Columbia, he then transfers over his membership from, I think it was Marion Lodge in Ohio, to the District of Columbia. He becomes affiliated with a Blue Lodge here in DC. He joins the Royal Arch in DC. He does the Knights Templar in DC, and so you start to see those types of things.
Mm,
Unfortunately, it has been perhaps the custom that not a lot of guys are doing research into their own lodges. So we really don't have a good record of how many folks affiliated with, a certain lodge here in DC. We know that it's happened. I just don't have a record of it because we just don't have those records.
Mm. Another interesting thing, I'm sure our listener is curious about this question as well, is the idea of Masonic ritual and how sometimes
Sure.
you'll be like, I thought I heard them not quoting ritual, but that sounds very familiar to something that I had
Yeah.
to memorize that just came out of the mouth of, an actor in a movie or a
Right.
TV show. Were there any instances of, quote unquote, hearing Masonic ritual or it even being discussed in sessions of Congress?
Yeah, there's at least two very good ones that I found fascinating. There's one in which there's a member of Congress that is there's a debate going on within for the top of my head, I don't remember what the topic was, but there's a debate between two Masons, and one of the Masons mentioned I'm not going to say the ritual, but there's a unique ritual associated with the 24-inch gauge. There's a story behind the 24-inch gauge and how one separates their time most efficiently. And so in the ritual, in the congressional records, the person is talking about the ritual. He's actually saying very close. Maybe it is actually their ritual. Maybe different. It certainly is different in DC, but they are explaining what the usage of the 24-inch gauge is during the debate. They're having this debate, and he's reminding the other Mason, well, the 24 hours is divided by, and I won't finish that sentence, but that is a very unique instance. The other instance, which I find just astonishing for two facts. Number one is there was a Maryland senator who unfortunately died during his term in office. And so they held a funeral for him in open session of Congress. The President of the United States was invited to participate in that ceremony. They conducted a Templar funeral service in the session of Congress. The President of the United States at the time was Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln watched a Templar funeral service in the Capitol.
Wow.
Now, you also have to, there is also in the congressional record, they may have not said it, but in the congressional record, for anyone and everyone to see, they have transcriptions of cornerstone laying ceremonies, dedications to monuments, and other events. So even if they don't mention, even if a congressman doesn't mention the ritual out of his mouth, there are records that have been included as part of the official record of the United States government that shows Masonic ritual happening.
Not to give any of the senators ideas, but when the idea of filibustering a bill comes back up, I'm trying to think of large parts of our ritual that are out there in open plain text that you could just start talking about if you needed to kill a couple hours.
That's right. If any congressman wants to crack open Congress and Freemasons or go through the history of Freemasonry in the United States, I'm happy to offer that for a filibuster.
So we've talked about this project, the new book, Congress and the Freemasons. It will be in stores by the time that this podcast is released. You can always get it via his website as well. That's chrisruli.com. We'll make sure to have the links here in the notes for this episode. We don't want Chris to sell his books. That's my job. As we're celebrating America 250 this summer. Perfect timing again, man. It's like this guy had his own trestle board and circled this about 1,000 times for a date.
Years in the making.
Let's talk about the years part. So I know you came and most graciously spoke at my lodge here in DC. You've visited several lodges to talk about the White House and the Freemasons. How soon or during that project did you go, hey, you know what? I think I might have another book here, and I didn't realize this was going to take 2, 3, 4, how many years to get to the final product?
Yeah, I think it was easy because when I was working on when I was working on the White House and the Freemasons, you would find instances where the President of the United States invites members of Congress to participate. And so what I did was during that time, I would just, on another notepad or another sheet, I would just quickly jot down every time I would see a congressman participate or, attend a dinner or a meeting or maybe speak, right? Just like speak as the keynote speaker of a Masonic activity. And so I would write that down and knock that down. And then as I was wrapping up my Lafayette book, as I was going around the United States preparing for Lafayette's visit, which I think we talked about. Yes, I think we certainly talked
Oh,
about it.
yes. Yeah.
Um, I thought, this is the right time to start really focusing on Congress, because it's a topic that comes up. It's a topic that even during my discussions in the White House, people will bring up, during the Q&A. Hey, have you thought about doing Congress? Or hey, have you thought about focusing on, the other different branches? And it was always something I wanted to focus on. And I thought, because we're celebrating America 250 soon, it seems appropriate to offer this to our Masons.
Mm. I've secretly written down the name of my famous congressman who I found out was a Freemason and was kind of a surprise to me. I'll tell you, I got to meet him in person at one of our District of Columbia Masonic congressional breakfasts a few years back, and was
Yeah.
just blown away to shake this man's hand. And we'll be happy to share that story. But first, I wanted to ask you, because I think that's going to be the thing that's going to be surprising to a lot of people. Our presidents, we know some of them, they're on monuments, they're on our money, their pictures are hanging in our lodges, but members of Congress, maybe not so much. So who were some of the key people that you came across and you're like, oh, wow, I didn't even know this person was a Mason, or I didn't even know who this person was, or that they were a Mason and that they did this great thing to advance our cause?
Yeah, I will admit, as the history nerd in me, I was always interested in the founders and sort of that early group of, founding fathers who were Masons. Not because, I think that, I mean, obviously there's an interest in figuring out the questions of how did they contribute to the formation of the United States government, but through my research, I find that there's slight debate over if this guy was a Mason or not. And
Mm,
so there's this sort of puzzle box that is happening, trying to figure out if this guy's a Mason, if this guy's not a Mason, where are we getting our records from? Who said he was a Mason anyway? Where did that start? And so to me, I like unpacking a mystery. And so there's John Dickinson, who sort of has this weird thing of, we make him a Mason, but we don't really have any records of it. But other people are saying, oh no, he was definitely a Mason. Well, how do we know? We just don't. But he's been included in that list. And sort of like what happened in the White House and the Freemasons, these stories, right? This telephone game starts to happen, and say, well, of course he's a Mason, because so and so in so and so's book 30 years ago, they wrote that down. And well, where did that person get it? Where did that person get it? From a contemporary standpoint, it has been fun. I don't know.
mm,
Maybe it has been fun reaching out to current members of Congress and, asking if they would be willing to recognize out themselves as Masons. One of the things I realized is, in the congressional record, in the past, you used to write down every organization you were a member of when you joined Congress. So in the 1930s and 40s, for example, you see clear as day where they joined the Elks, where they joined the Shriners, where they joined the Masons, where they joined, the Odd Fellows, the Red Men, whatever. And now you're starting to see fewer and fewer people share that information. The
mm.
congressional records are becoming a lot thinner, a lot smaller, and a lot harder to access. And so once in
Why
a
do you think
while,
that is?
I think changes in society. I think the
Mm,
fraternity has taken on a spooky aspect that they can't really, and I mean the institution, not an individual Grand Lodge. I think it's very difficult for us to explain what the fraternity is now, even though we have a history of being an open and public organization for many years. And I
mm.
think I've talked to you about this in the last, in the last podcast, where we're a public institution. We've always been a public institution, despite what people say. We produce minutes, we produce proceedings, we produce transactions, we share those out to other Grand Lodges and libraries and institutions. So we know how these people organized, right? A cornerstone laying, a public cornerstone laying. Most Masons, or I hope a Mason has had the opportunity to participate in a cornerstone laying ceremony. If you have, you'll see that we talk about the ritual. We talk about what the symbology or the symbolism of certain
Yeah.
implements are,
Even
um,
our funerals, the Masonic funerals, the degree is performed right there in
the degrees,
essence.
the information, the ritual is performed there, and we tell you what these things are important and why these things are important,
Hmm.
why they're so important to us. And so I think we have done. There's this sort of I don't know, maybe double-edged sword, where we want to be really spooky and scary and interesting, and oh, we're in the secrets, but then the organization has a difficult time explaining to the public what that means. So what I often do is, well, I'm a part of a fraternal organization that your grandfather was probably a member of, or your grandmother was probably a member of. I had clerks, right? Like people, researchers, folks in the Library of Congress, the office of the Senate, and the House of Representatives, the office, like the historical offices. There was one person who I was working with trying to get photographs for something, and she said, Chris, that's so interesting. My grandmother was a member of the Order of Eastern Star, and I had no idea what this masonry meant. She never talked about it. And so it's interesting that you're doing this presentation. I said, well, we were a lot more public than we used to be. And so do we want to still be the spooky people that, do these interesting rituals? And at the same time, how do we explain ourselves to the public? Well, for 100 plus 50 years, it was very easy to explain to the public because many individuals were interested in joining and then joined. But we decided, I don't know how, and I don't know why, but we decided to make ourselves a little bit more closed off, a little bit more spooky, more focused on the ritual than on all the things that we did for 150 years or 200.
So the brother that I got to meet, excuse me, the brother that I got to meet, was part of the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia. Does this, wonderful Universal Brotherhood celebration every summer at the nation's capital. And some of the events change over the years, but one year we had done a congressional breakfast. And as someone who's worked and had a job that's associated with the work that happens at Congress, a congressional breakfast is pretty cool. You get to go to the basement of the U.S. Capitol, which you're like, oh, wow. And there's all these nice little conference rooms that are set up there with, a buffet. And the idea is that there were going to be some of the members of Congress who were brothers that would speak there, but also members of their staff. And because they're members of Congress and they're working around the clock, there's no really set schedule. It's like, oh, someone's coming. Everybody sit down. And then we would sit down and they would get up and make their remarks and comments. And the one that was I was blown away was Honorable Brother Jim Clyburn from South Carolina. One, because I'm like, here's the guy that got Joe Biden elected. And number two, here was such a big part of the civil rights movement and probably like the last link to that part of history that's living and talking about his experience. And he talked about a book that he was going to have forthcoming. But when we were talking about brothers that you read their story and you were impacted by them, you had mentioned a couple of brothers, but did you have any revelations like that where you're like, I was aware somewhat of this person, but now knowing that they're a Freemason, it's kind of elevated them in my mind a little?
Oh, interesting. I'm fascinated by the fact that Chuck Schumer is a Mason.
I could almost drop my pen right now. That I would have never guessed.
Yeah, we have his lodge.
Senator Schumer. Wow. Okay.
We know that we have his lodge. We know that he was a member. And I'm fascinated by that, not in a negative or, I'm not saying like I'm a Democrat or Republican or anything. It's just I'm fascinated that he is in the limelight, obviously, every day in our contemporary time. There's a lot of criticism about what he's doing, whatever. I don't want to get into politics, but I'm fascinated that he was or is a Mason. And he can, as far as I know, I don't know if he goes around talking about it. He doesn't attend Masonic activities or events. I'm just fascinated by his decision to stay where he is in the fraternity. I'm also fascinated by how it is often done in secret or quietly. It's not, there's nothing to hide. It's just that they don't particularly find that necessary to talk about. There's a really good example, by the way, in the book that I found where I think it was the 1980s or 1990s. My dates are getting confused here, but there was a judge who was trying to get appointed, a federal judge, who has to go through the appointment process. And one congressman found out that this judge was a Mason and basically said, I'm going to reserve my vote on this guy because I just don't know if Freemasonry is actually going to impact or influence his ability to make decisions on the court. Well, congressmen started to jump in, and in an open session of Congress, folks on multiple sides came in to defend this guy in the fraternity. Goes on, You had Strom Thurmond, for example, jump up and say, "Listen, I'm a Freemason. I've been a Freemason, blah blah blah. This is an excellent organization, you know." And you can see it in the book, but they sort of come to this gentleman's defense strictly because they're a Mason. And you had a couple other guys jump in to defend him, and this was, you know, a multi-day sort of thing where once they found out, a couple other guys the following day jumped in to defend this decision and say, you know, Masonry has nothing to do with this gentleman's ability to make a smart decision on the court. You know, here it's a fraternal organization. And so to me, that was a very good example of how the fraternity has sort of moved away from the public limelight. When you have congressmen from different sides of the aisle taking a pause in their debates to go, wait a minute, we all have to jump in and support what's going on here because this is not right. So I think that is another one of those interesting cases of just like I would not have expected that. I wouldn't have, and it's in the record, so anyone can go and take a look at that discussion and exchange.
Or they could just read it in Congress and the Freemasons, which is available July of 2026. The website, chrisruli.com, or you can open up the link to this episode and bang, find all the places that you can get this book. And I like to get the autograph copy myself, and I save a little spot like right there on the shelf and go, that's my book. Good man. Chris. He's my friend. I'll get you out of here on this one, Brother Chris. Well, I've got one more question, which is every author's least favorite question, so I'll save that for the end. Sure. But this one's the more fun question, and it was one of the things that I honestly really enjoyed during my time serving as a Grand Rep to the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia near the Grand Lodge of New York, and that would be visiting brethren that would be coming down from New York to DC and be like, hey, what are some of the suggestions? And of course, there's the George Washington National Museum, which is really cool in Alexandria. There's the George Washington Monument right there on Capitol Hill with all of the other things to see and do in the National Mall. But now that there's something like this book and people visiting from anywhere across the U.S., and I know this is a good time to ask because it's summertime and people come to DC to see this, what are some of the must attend or kind of cool go check this out things that you would point to based on the research that you've done or just your experiences living here?
Well, if you haven't had an opportunity to go into the Library of Congress, the Jefferson Building, or actually any of the buildings, you got to check them out. I mean, it's beautiful. It's open to the public. You got to get a reader's card, but go in there, take a look at the beautiful things, the books that they have, the records that they have. Take an opportunity to tour the buildings. The Smithsonian, you know, is another one that has a lot of records. And that's one of those things where I'm like, one of these days I might do another book just on the Smithsonian because it's so unique, right? 10% of what the Smithsonian has is out in display. So there are things that we don't even know about. There are in boxes that have yet to see the light of day. And so that to me, as a researcher, I'm always interested in. If you get an opportunity, of course, come to the House of the Temple. We actually have our own Americanism museum with lots of materials and interesting insights on, you know, Masons who served in Congress or in some public capacity, you know, that people might find interesting. If you are fortunate enough, like me, to get a very nice invitation, you may even attend a meeting in the building, in the Capitol. Naval Lodge number 4 has had the tradition of holding a session of their lodge, a special communication in the Capitol building. It is a very cool event. It is a very informal event, I would say. There's no pomp and circumstance. It is done by approval of a representative of Congress who permits them to hold their session in his office. And so it's a cool thing to do. I've done it the last 4 or 5 years now, and it's been an honor to come and serve as the speaker for those events. And I think we're already scheduling our next opportunity. And gee whiz, we're going to talk about the Capitol and the Congress and the Freemasons. So that's obviously going to be an interesting topic. But it's one of those opportunities that people rarely get. And if you can score a seat, I think you'd find that really interesting.
Another one
I have to clarify, I'm not a member of Naval Lodge number 4. And so I go at their invitation. It's not something that I can that I can bring people, but it's something that, if you're interested, reach out to the worship master of the lodge and see if you can score a seat.
Yeah, that is a special one that is a little bit more, well, it's widely available, but you do need to go online ahead of time and get a ticket to get in. There's a little bit of a background check that'll be done as well, but they recently have reopened, well, not recently, but within the last couple of years, they've reopened the U.S. Capitol tours. And
Nice.
those are very special too, to go see the rotunda. And if you
Yes.
can, line up the chance to find out who your member of the House of Representatives is, and go
Right.
visit your congressman. And
Yeah.
again, if you're a brother, go talk to him about the things that are important to your lodge and your community, because he's there to be serving and working for you. So
Yeah.
take some of that time.
Yeah. I will
All right.
say one of the things that was sort of shocking to certain, individuals, Masons. I mean, when talking about this subject, I think one of the things they don't realize is, like, remember I told you there were those 4 phases, and the last one is about people submitting things to be placed in the official record, just like congratulating Masons for hitting a certain milestone, or a lodge for hitting a special anniversary. There's a lot of congressmen right now who are very public. Some Masons would not like them. They might detest them, in fact. Some of them are women. And some of those individuals have submitted on behalf of Masonic lodges these commemorations recognizing the fraternity and recognizing all the good works. So I think sometimes we get ahead of ourselves with all the rhetoric and the things that we see online. But some of those individuals, you'd be like, wow, I can't believe, Representative so-and-so submitted a nice commemoration recognizing our little lodge in, whatever state. And so know that those resources are available. Like, you can, if you want, have a member of Congress recognize a nice anniversary with a special commemoration that will be in the public record, ad infinitum. So, maybe in the end, to close, to wrap up, I hope that this book gives people a little bit of inspiration on how you can engage with your member of Congress too, because there's a lot of ways to do it. Perhaps it's doing a tour, perhaps it's getting access to, as you mentioned, the Capitol tours or the White House tours. Going through your member of Congress is how you can do that. And if you have a special celebration coming up, reach out to your member of Congress and see if they can get a nice, commemoration or an anniversary or something that they can do for you. You'd be surprised how they'll be happy to respond.
So when you were here to talk about the White House and the Freemasons, that led to a conversation about Lafayette and the return of Lafayette. You did not tease, hey, I'm working on this Congress and the Freemasons book idea, but you did say you had a couple other projects that were in the fire. So my last question, and it's every author's least favorite, is, so what's next? What are you going to write for us next? What are you working on?
If you know anything about me right now, that you know that I'm heavily involved in the Scottish Rite of the Supreme Council of the Southern jurisdiction. And so a lot of my work right now is focused on the Scottish Rite Research Society. And so by the time you listen to this podcast, dear listener, I will probably have 2 or 3 books that we have produced for the Scottish Rite Research Society that will be out. And they are interesting books on the history of funeral services in the Scottish Rite. A really nice resource on the early history of the Supreme Council, a biography of the founders of the Scottish Rite in Charleston, South Carolina, and then illustrious Art de Hoyos and I are working on a couple other projects that I think folks will really like. And I've done the White House, I've done the executive branch, I've done the legislative branch. So American citizens may, see that and go, well, there's one left that you might want to take a look at. So maybe, who knows, in the future, I might be talking about a 3rd branch.
All right. Love we leave that future door open. The book is Congress and the Freemasons. The brother is Chris Ruli. His website, chrisruli.com. Always a pleasure to have you here on the Craftsman Online Podcast.